FBI Headquarters, Washington, D.C., February 15, 1977, Tuesday morning, 9:30 a.m. In a windowless office on the 5th floor of the J. Edgar Hoover FBI building, Special Agent Patricia Morrison opens a manila folder marked Confidential Presley, Elvis Aaron File No. 161-338. The folder is thick, containing 683 pages of surveillance reports, wiretap transcripts, informant statements, and photographs accumulated over 7 years of federal monitoring. What Agent Morrison doesn't know is that in 6 months, the subject of this massive file will be dead, and 3 years after that, these documents will be declassified, revealing one of the most extensive celebrity surveillance operations in American history. The Elvis Presley FBI file contains 683 pages. Most are heavily redacted, black bars obscuring names, locations, and methods of surveillance. But what remains visible tells a story that shocked the world when it was finally released in 1980. The United States government spent 7 years treating the king of rock and roll as a potential threat to national security. The surveillance began in 1970, ironically the same year Elvis met with President Richard Nixon to volunteer as an undercover federal agent in the war on drugs. The meeting, which took place on December 21, 1970, was Elvis's idea, a patriotic gesture from a man who wanted to use his influence to help combat what he saw as the corruption of American youth by illegal drugs. But while Elvis was offering his services to the government was already watching him. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover had authorized surveillance of Elvis Presley based on reports that the entertainer was using his celebrity status to promote anti-establishment values and that his concerts were becoming gathering points for subversive elements. The surveillance operation was comprehensive and invasive, utilizing every tool available to the FBI in the 1970s. Agents attended Elvis concerts under cover identities, documenting not just his performances, but audience reactions and looking for signs of incitement to riot. They monitored his phone calls through wiretaps placed on multiple lines at Graceland, his Beverly Hills home, and his Las Vegas penthouse. They intercepted his mail, photographed his visitors from unmarked vehicles, and recruited informants within his inner circle, members of the so-called Memphis Mafia, who reported on Elvis's private conversations and activities. The surveillance network was extensive. Page 89 reveals that FBI had established observation posts near Graceland, with agents maintaining watch from rented houses across the street. They documented every visitor, every delivery, every movement, using telephoto lenses to photograph license plates and build a comprehensive database of Elvis's associates. Technical surveillance was equally invasive. Page 134 describes listening devices planted in Elvis's hotel suites during Vegas residencies. FBI technicians, posing as maintenance workers, installed microphones in lamps, picture frames, and telephone handsets, capturing intimate moments with friends, family, and romantic partners. The 683 pages reveal a government agency obsessed with Elvis's potential for social disruption. Page 47 contains a report from Agent Robert Carlyle, who attended an Elvis concert in Las Vegas on March 15, 1973, noting subject's performance included gyrating movements and suggestive lyrics that appeared designed to incite sexual excitement among female audience members, many of whom appeared to lose emotional control. Approximately 200 females rushed the stage during the performance, requiring additional security intervention. The report continues. Subject made statements between songs that could be interpreted as political commentary, including references to young men dying far from home and politicians who don't understand regular folks. While these statements were presented as patriotic sentiment, they could be utilized by anti-war groups to validate opposition to current military policies. Page 156 documents a conversation between Elvis and guitarist James Burton, captured through electronic surveillance on February 3, 1974. Subject expressed anger at government policies regarding Vietnam War, stating that young men are dying for nothing and that politicians sitting in Washington don't care about boys from small towns who just want to serve their country. Subject also stated that music is the only honest thing left in this country. The report notes that such statements indicate possible anti-government sentiment that could be used to influence fan base of approximately 50 million Americans, particularly among demographics already inclined toward anti-establishment attitudes. What the FBI didn't understand was that Elvis's criticism of government policies came not from radical political beliefs, but from genuine concern for the young men fighting in Vietnam, many of whom were his fans. Elvis received thousands of letters from soldiers serving overseas, thanking him for his music and asking for encouragement. These letters deeply affected Elvis, making him question a war that was taking the lives of people who looked to him for inspiration. The surveillance revealed intimate details of Elvis's personal life that had nothing to do with national security. Page 203 contains a report on Elvis's prescription drug use, based on information provided by an unnamed confidential informant who had access to Graceland. The report notes that subject relies heavily on prescription medications for sleep and energy, consuming what appears to be dangerous quantities of amphetamines and barbiturates. This information was gathered not for Elvis's health or safety, but because the FBI believed his drug use made him vulnerable to blackmail by foreign agents or criminal organizations. The possibility that Elvis might be compromised and used against American interests was taken seriously enough to justify years of surveillance. Page 278 documents the FBI's investigation into Elvis's charitable activities, specifically his habit of giving away cars, jewelry, and large sums of money to strangers. An agent's report notes, subject's pattern of random gift-giving raises questions about possible money laundering or other financial crimes. Investigation ongoing to determine if these activities mask payments to criminal associates. The FBI couldn't comprehend that Elvis's generosity was simply generosity, a wealthy man sharing his fortune with people who needed help. They saw conspiracy where there was only kindness, criminal activity where there was only a generous heart. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the file is the evidence that Elvis knew he was being watched, and the psychological toll this knowledge took on him. Page 445 contains a transcript of a phone conversation between Elvis and his manager, Colonel Tom Parker, recorded on June 12, 1975, in which Elvis says, "They're listening to everything we say, Colonel. I can feel them watching. Sometimes I think the phones are tapped. Hell, I know the phones are tapped." Parker's response, also captured on the wiretap, was dismissive. "You're being paranoid, my boy. Nobody cares what we say on the phone. You're letting the pills make you crazy." But Elvis was right to be paranoid. The government was listening to every call, reading every letter, watching every move. Page 467 documents an incident at Graceland on August 8, 1974, when Elvis became convinced that his bedroom was bugged. According to an informant's report, Elvis systematically dismantled 2 telephone handsets and examined them with a magnifying glass, claiming he could see the wires that don't belong. Subject then insisted that staff search all rooms for listening devices and threatened to tear the whole damn house apart if necessary. The paranoia intensified over time. Page 523 contains a report from January 1976, based on information from a confidential source with regular access to Graceland, describing Elvis's increasingly erratic behavior. Subject appeared increasingly agitated and suspicious, frequently checking windows and doors, asking guests if they had been followed to the property. Subject made multiple references to being watched and expressed belief that they were trying to destroy him because I know too much about what's really going on. The report continues. Subject has begun varying his routines randomly, taking different routes to destinations, and insisting that staff rotate vehicles to confuse the watchers. Subject also installed additional security cameras around Graceland property and hired private security firm to sweep for bugs on weekly basis. This paranoia, dismissed by those around Elvis as drug-induced delusion, was actually a rational response to very real surveillance. The man who could command the attention of 50,000 people from a stage felt powerless against invisible government agents who monitored his every private moment. The psychological impact extended beyond mere paranoia. Page 551 documents how the surveillance affected Elvis's relationships based on observations from multiple informants. Subject has become increasingly isolated, expressing distrust of long-time associates and questioning the loyalty of family members. Subject frequently makes statements suggesting he believes someone close is reporting on his activities to government agents. The FBI's own informants were documenting the damage their surveillance was causing to Elvis's mental health. Yet the operation continued. Page 578 contains a psychiatric evaluation commissioned by the FBI in 1976, prepared by Dr. Marcus Wellman of the Bureau's Behavioral Science Unit. Subject exhibits classic symptoms of surveillance-induced paranoia, including hypervigilance, social withdrawal, and obsessive security behaviors. Paradoxically, subjects' paranoid beliefs appear to be largely accurate, creating a feedback loop where rational fear reinforces irrational behavioral responses. Dr. Wellman's evaluation recommended either discontinuing surveillance or limiting it to passive observation only, but his recommendations were ignored. A handwritten note in the margin, attributed to Associate Director Clyde Tolson, reads, "Subject's deteriorating mental state makes him more vulnerable to foreign exploitation, not less. Increase surveillance frequency." The file reveals that the FBI was particularly interested in Elvis's relationship with law enforcement. Page 367 documents the Bureau's investigation into Elvis's collection of police badges and his friendships with officers in Memphis, Las Vegas, and Los Angeles. The FBI worried that Elvis's influence with local police might be used to interfere with federal investigations or to gather intelligence about government activities. What they didn't understand was that Elvis's fascination with law enforcement came from his genuine desire to fight crime and help people. He carried guns, not because he was dangerous, but because he wanted to be ready to protect others. He collected police badges not to abuse authority, but because he respected the concept of service to community. Page 412 contains perhaps the most revealing document in the entire file, a psychological profile of Elvis Presley prepared by FBI behavioral analysts. The profile describes Elvis as a subject with significant influence over large segments of American youth, particularly those inclined toward anti-establishment attitudes. Subject's appeal transcends racial boundaries, making him potentially useful to groups seeking to unite diverse populations against government authority. The profile continues. Subject's personal vulnerabilities, including prescription drug dependency and financial pressures, create opportunities for exploitation by hostile foreign governments or domestic subversive organizations. Continued surveillance recommended to monitor for signs of such exploitation. This analysis reveals how little the FBI understood about Elvis as a person. They saw him as a security threat because of his influence, not recognizing that his influence came from his humanity, his authenticity, his genuine connection with people who felt overlooked by society. They monitored him for signs of anti-government activity, while missing the fact that Elvis was fundamentally patriotic, a man who loved his country deeply and wanted to serve it. The surveillance operation expanded significantly after Elvis's 1970 meeting with President Nixon. Page 476 documents the FBI's concern that Elvis might use his honorary federal agent status to access classified information or to interfere with actual law enforcement operations. Agents were assigned to monitor Elvis's interactions with federal agencies and to ensure that his special agent credentials were never used inappropriately. The irony was complete. Elvis had volunteered to help the government fight drugs, and the government responded by treating him as a potential drug-related security threat. He had offered his patriotic service, and they answered with suspicion and surveillance. Page 589 reveals one of the most invasive aspects of the surveillance: the FBI's recruitment of informants within Elvis's inner circle. The document, heavily redacted, references multiple confidential sources with regular access to subject who provided ongoing intelligence regarding subject's activities, associates, and statements. These informants were people Elvis trusted, friends, employees, possibly even romantic partners, who reported his private conversations to federal agents. The betrayal of trust was profound, turning Elvis's own circle into a network of surveillance that made genuine intimacy almost impossible. The file shows that the surveillance continued right up until Elvis's death in August 1977. Page 634, dated July 15, 1977, contains a report on Elvis's final concert tour, noting subject appeared increasingly erratic in behavior and physical appearance, raising questions about continued fitness for public performances that might incite audience disturbances. Even in his final weeks, when Elvis was clearly struggling with health problems and prescription drug addiction, the FBI was more concerned about his potential to cause public disturbances than about his obvious need for medical help. They watched him deteriorate without offering assistance, documenting his decline as potential evidence of unfitness rather than recognizing it as a cry for help. When the 683-page file was declassified in 1980, 3 years after Elvis's death, it caused a sensation. The declassification took 3 years of legal battles. Initially, FBI claimed no such files existed, then acknowledged only a limited administrative file of fewer than 50 pages. Only after court orders did the agency reveal the true scope of surveillance. Even declassified, documents were heavily censored. Entire pages were blacked out. Names, methods, and operational details were redacted so thoroughly that some pages contained only a few visible words. What could be read was damning. Headlines proclaimed, "FBI watched Elvis for 7 years and government spy files on the king." But the deeper significance revealed government attitudes towards celebrity influence during the 1970s. At a time when the FBI was also surveilling civil rights leaders, anti-war protesters, and political activists, Elvis Presley was added to the list simply because his fame gave him a platform that could potentially be used to influence public opinion. The file demonstrates the danger of unchecked government surveillance power. Elvis was monitored not because he committed crimes or threatened national security, but because his influence made government officials uncomfortable. His popularity with young people, his ability to cross racial boundaries through music, his financial independence, all of these factors made him seem dangerous to an establishment that preferred predictable, controllable public figures. Page 621 contains perhaps the most chilling document in the entire file, a 1976 memorandum from FBI Assistant Director W. Raymond Wannell to Director Clarence Kelly, titled Presley, Elvis Security Assessment and Recommendations. The memo reads, "Subject's continued popularity and influence over American youth, combined with his increasingly erratic behavior and anti-establishment statements, present ongoing security concerns. Subject's access to law enforcement credentials through honorary appointments creates additional risk of intelligence compromise." The memo continues. Recommendation: maintain current surveillance levels through 1977. Consider expansion of informant network within subject's personal circle. Explore opportunities for controlled compromise of subject's public reputation to diminish influence over target demographics. This final recommendation, to deliberately damage Elvis's reputation to reduce his cultural influence, reveals the FBI's surveillance program as more than passive monitoring. They were actively considering destroying a man's career because they feared his popularity. The Elvis file also provides a window into the mindset of government agencies during the surveillance-heavy 1970s. In the post-Watergate era, when Americans were learning about COINTELPRO, illegal wiretapping, and other government surveillance abuses, the Elvis file offered concrete evidence of how these programs affected individual citizens, even famous ones. The Elvis file demonstrates how surveillance can become self-perpetuating. Once labeled a subject of interest, every action was interpreted as potential threat. His charitable giving became possible money laundering. His Vietnam criticism became potential subversion. His police friendships became possible intelligence gathering. The 683 pages of the Elvis Presley FBI file, heavily redacted and filled with mundane surveillance details, tell a larger story about power, fame, and the price of being different in a society that values conformity. They document not just the surveillance of a singer, but the government's fear of anyone whose influence might challenge authority, whose popularity might transcend the boundaries that keep society manageable and controllable. Elvis Presley died, never knowing that his paranoia was justified, that his fear of being watched was based in reality, that his sense of being targeted by forces beyond his control was accurate. The file that documented his life was sealed until after his death, ensuring that he would never have the satisfaction of knowing he was right to be afraid, never have the vindication of seeing his suspicions confirmed. But perhaps that was the point. Perhaps the real purpose of surveillance is not just to gather information, but to create exactly the kind of uncertainty, paranoia, and isolation that made Elvis's final years so difficult. Perhaps the FBI file on Elvis Presley was not just a record of surveillance, but a weapon of psychological warfare against a man whose only crime was being too influential, too loved, and too free. The Elvis file stands as a warning about what happens when government security apparatus targets individuals based on their influence rather than their actions, and as a reminder that in any surveillance state, fame provides no protection. It only makes you a more valuable target.